My name is Scott Ritter. In the first episode, I told you how Vadir Zilinski came to power, who he really is, and who recruited him. Everyone knows that agents are given tasks. Zelensky is no exception. However, in his case, it's more like obligations, debts that cannot be ignored, like a deal with the devil. Over the course of 4 years of presidency, he has accomplished or brought to fruition at least 10 important tasks. Each of them, to varying degrees, has contributed to the destruction of Ukraine. Today, we'll examine all of them in detail. So task number 1, to eliminate the Russian language.
If people in the East and Crimea want to speak Russian, let them. Leave them alone. Provide them with the opportunity to speak Russian on a legal basis. Language should never divide our home country.
2014, the words of this charming guy in a t-shirt resonated with many people in Ukraine, not just Russians. There were also many Ukrainians who spoke Russian and feared its prohibition. There were reasons for these concerns. Immediately after the Maidan protests, the Verkhovna Rada decided to repeal the law on the principles of the state language policy. This law had been in effect since 2012 and granted regional status to the Russian language in areas where it was the native language for at least 10% of the population. The repeal of this law became one of the reasons for the secession of Crimea and the civil war in the Donbas region. In the meantime, Zelensky himself had always spoken Russian and, most importantly, had defended it for many years until he became the president. In 2020, Zelensky made all schools in Ukraine Ukrainian language only. In my home country, the United States, documents and websites are created in 2 languages, English and Spanish. There are many Spanish language schools, and no one forces them to switch to English. This is fair and understandable. What's not understandable, why is English and not Russian the second language in Ukraine? Can you explain that to me? Are there many English Americans or Australians there?
The greatest inconsistency in what Zelensky and the Kiev government say lies in the fact that after starting the civil war in 2014, while attempting to restrict and prohibit the use of the native language by the population of Donbas, they now say, we will unite all territories into one nation. However, what is happening in Donbas today is an attempt of the Western Ukrainians, Galatians, and those who are anti-Russian to carry out ethnic cleansing. This presents a real problem, and this aspect is often silenced in the West.
Not only is it being silenced out, the West also supports it, and Zelensky is happy to do his best. Since January 2021, the entire service sector in the country has been switched to Ukrainian. You know, Zelensky once named Ukraine the center and heart of Europe. It seems to me that he got it wrong with the organs. It is heartless to violate the rights of 12.5 million of his own citizens. In the summer of 2021, the Constitutional Court of the country upheld the law on the Ukrainian language. Violations of this law are subject to fines. How could one hate his own people so much as to punish them for their native language? But take a look at this video. President Zelensky is pretending hard and diligently that he has forgotten Russian.
Далее гуманитарная катастрофа однозначно внутри, в городе, потому что заехать продукты питания, лекарств, составляются списки. Наши ребята составляли, я знаю, составляли списки военные ребята, все, кто в полоне, в плену, да, все, кто в плену.
Perhaps someone will tell him that this is a disgusting play that won't convince even a child. Another obligation of such type to Western handlers was task number 2, to finalize the church split.
Suitcase, train station, Russia.
April of 2023. Siege into Kyiv, Pyrtych, Lavra. What you see is a result of a long and painstaking work of my fellow countrymen. In December 2018, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or OCU, emerged in Ukraine with the support of Petro Poroshenko and the United States. One might wonder why. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch already existed in the country, but apparently The term Moscow was a significant hindrance for the Ukrainian authorities to pray. That's why they created their own church with blackjack and their own tomos. In 2019, the OCU received a decree from the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, granting them autocephaly, that is, the independence from the Russian Orthodox Church.
That it formally remained part of the Russian Orthodox Church. Except for that formality, everything that Kiev possibly could have asked for was granted by Moscow. The tomos issued from Constantinople is a very different thing entirely. Supposed autocephaly, but under the control of Constantinople. That almost every detail of church life within the so-called schismatic church must be approved by Patriarch Bartholomew, who of course himself is then under the control of the State Department and the CIA.
The head of the OCU, Serhiy Epiphanius Dominko, started receiving frequent visits from American guests. In 2019, William Taylor, charged the affairs to Ukraine, came to meet him. And in January 2020, former CIA Director and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo paid a visit. The purpose of this visit will be revealed by him a bit later.
I made sure the U.S. supported international recognition of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, helped the Metropolitan escape Russian influence.
Epiphanius awarded Mike Pompeo with a medal for this. Then there were meetings with Kurt Volker, the former U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine. After that, there was a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The meeting's schedule resembled that of a foreign affairs minister. Americans used Zelensky to complete the division of Ukrainian Orthodox believers into the right and wrong factions. The right ones attended the sanctuaries of the new church, while with the assistance of the Ukrainian authorities, they seized temples from the canonical church and expelled the priests. Finally, the situation escalated to the Kiev-Pechersky Lavra. As far as I know, it is one of the most important and ancient Orthodox shrines, dating back over 1,000 years. Unfortunately, the Kiev-Pechersky Lavra was under the administration of monks from the Canonical Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. The Ministry of Culture of Ukraine decided it was heresy and terminated the lease agreement with the monastery. Security forces and nationalists besieged the walls of the Lavra. Now, the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church is under the threat of prohibition, and Volodymyr Zelensky continues to train his persuasive skills in his speeches.
Today, another step has been taken to strengthen the spiritual independence of our state and protect our society from old and cynical Moscow manipulations with religion. Ukraine is a territory of the greatest religious freedom in our part of Europe.
It's been very successful in creating, I would say, kind of a fake Ukrainian, artificial Ukrainian identity that is hostile to Russia, that defines itself in opposition to a Russian identity. It grew somewhat during the Soviet time, but really has taken advantage of the last period since 1991, since Ukraine became an independent state.
In this substitution of Ukrainians' identity, common roots are being torn apart, and common shrines are being violated. The great victory over the Nazis in 1941-1945 had always united this nation. Even Volodymyr Zelensky recalled it not long ago.
You know, my grandfather, Simeon's brothers, and their families were killed by the Nazis. At that time, my grandfather was at the front. In the end, he endured the entire war and returned as a victor.
Volodymyr Zelensky's grandfather, Semyon Ivanovich, commanded a mortar platoon during the Great Patriotic War. In Soviet Ukraine, people like Semyon Zalinsky were glorified with monuments and memorial sites. However, under Volodymyr Zelensky, all of these monuments have been destroyed, as it was in the 1940s under Hitler. Rewriting history has become the third task for Zelensky. Victory Day on May 9th was replaced with Europe Day by the President of Ukraine. If he remains in power a little longer, I am certain that Ukrainians will start celebrating July 4th, the Independence Day of the United States, together with us. I've witnessed how everything Russian is being canceled in the West with the start of the special operation. Flags, poets, artists, musicians, they've all been banned. I am convinced that this was a planned campaign. The same thing happened in Ukraine, and it became another tool of division.
I want to remove Lenin and instead put someone who will be admired by everyone in the country. It's called literary characters. Definitely not politicians. What's stopping you? Bulgakov? Ukrainian? Ukrainian. If you want to rub it into your neighbor, put up Gogol.
Gogol, Bulgakov. Under President Zelensky, Bulgakov was officially labeled as Russophobic, and his memorial plaque was removed from the wall of a university in Kyiv. Writer Nikolai Ostrovsky, who apparently came from Ukraine, didn't satisfy him either. Scientist Mikhail Lomonosov, writer Maxim Gorky, and finally, Alexander Pushkin. The great writer was the one who offended Ukrainian authorities the most. But what about freedom of speech and the media? It was precisely this issue that the head of MI6 discussed with Zelensky during their face-to-face meeting in London. There, Zelensky was given task number 4.
I personally stand for freedom of speech, and you know that very well. I will never in my life shut down any channels. I don't have the right. I don't have the authority.
Just a year and a half later, with full belief in the circumstances presented, following the teachings of Stanislavski, he made the following statement.
This trio of channels contain talking armies that deceived and brainwashed you very professionally.
On February 3rd, 2021, 3 Ukrainian television channels, ZIK, News 1, and 112 Ukraine, were shut down. The decision was made by the National Security and Defense Council under Zelensky's order, of course.
There is currently no threat to freedom of speech or media business in Ukraine.
I will repeat those words. There is no threat to freedom of speech. This was said on the day when 3 television channels were shut down. A year later, Zelensky fulfilled another obligation. Let's call it task number 5. He banned the opposition.
Certain political parties' activities are suspended at the time of martial law.
On March 20th, 2022, the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, under Zelensky's orders, banned 11 opposition parties. No one in Ukraine objected to the funeral of freedom of speech. Those who could have objected were either killed, arrested, or fled the country.
We were told that under Zelensky, dollar would cost 45. There would be chaos in Ukraine, there would be war. But none of this happened.
Zelensky is not much of a prophet. Although in 2019, there was no order on the organization of training for a battalion tactical group of the 4th Operational Brigade to carry out combat special tasks in the Joint Forces operation as part of the armed forces of the Ukrainian Brigade. This is a secret document confirming Ukraine's preparation for an attack on Donbass in March 2022. Evidence can be found in other documents as well, including the new military strategy approved by Zelensky after the meeting at MI6, which we discussed in the first episode.
We see words from Oxford Dictionary and a term existential threat, never used before. Also, for the first time ever, we see in this document the use of population as a human shield. The document stated that Ukraine should prepare for active offensive actions to liberate Donbass. It was clear that the war till the last Ukrainian was being planned.
As you can see, the provocation was successful. Russia struck a few days earlier than Ukraine, and Zelensky was taken aback and frightened.
On my way from the Kremlin, I called Zelensky and said, "Listen, I just came from a meeting. Putin has no intention of killing you." Zelensky asked, "Are you sure?" I replied, 100% sure. 2 hours later, Zelensky returned to his office and recorded a video saying, "I'm not afraid. Everyone's in place. We're all working."
The president doesn't leave Kyiv and stays with the people. What an artist dies. Perhaps he'll finally be awarded with an Oscar. After all, he tries his best, especially in this video.
This is where I live. Is this the president's bed? Were you here on the 24th? I was. Well, we also went down to the bomb shelter.
Looking at a tiny room, one can't help but sympathize with the president. This poor guy lives and works in purely Spartan conditions.
So this is where I live. Well, could you say this is your home? It's my home. I've lived here for a year.
I almost believed it. Alas, the head of Ukraine lied. Again.
There is a well-equipped bomb shelter on Bankova Street. It was built during the Soviet era when the Soviet Union faced a real nuclear threat. These are long-term facilities that allowed every member of the apparatus to function, not just one individual. So there are no small rooms there, of course. Well, anything can be staged.
But who cares about the truth when everyone is watching the tragic comedy starring Zelensky? The first thing his PR team did after February 24, 2022 was a new image, the military style, as if the president had just returned from the front lines. The unshaven look, the sunken face due to sleepless nights of hard work. However, narcologists would argue all the signs of cocaine abuse are evident. Constant nose sniffing, and inappropriate reaction. Speech is solely from the prompter. But British specialists took precautions. They even created a hologram of the Ukrainian president.
All of these technological possibilities can change public life.
This addiction can be explained. It is quite common in the acting industry, from which Zelensky comes from. Unfortunately for the country, the Ukrainian president not only didn't quit, but apparently let himself go. It all began with weed.
Medical marijuana, in my opinion, is normal. It is sold in small quantities, droplets.
In 2020, Zelensky proposed legalizing cannabis in the country. At that time, his suggestion didn't go any further. However, everything changed when the war began. It's no secret that Ukrainian soldiers get stoned before going into battle, and weed is the least harmful substance they consume on the front lines, though they have someone to look up to in that regard. This is very pleasing to American and British intelligence agencies. It would be a sin not to take advantage of a drug-addicted president for their own purposes. He is completely manageable. I suppose that Western handlers supply him with the purest drugs. It brings to mind the Opium Wars when England, in order to advance its interests, addicted almost the entire Chinese elite to drugs. I cannot speak for all of Zelensky's inner circle, but he himself alone was enough to accomplish what would never work with a sober person. For example, turning the country into an experimental playground and convincing others that it was great.
We are interested in testing modern systems in the fight against the enemy, and we are inviting arms manufacturers to test their new products here. So I think for our partners in Poland, in the United States, France, or Germany, it's a good chance to test their equipment.
The sixth goal Zelensky was tasked with was to turn Ukraine into a testing ground, not only for weapons, but also for experiments on people. In 2005, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, was established in the country. It is a pet project of the U.S. Department of Defense, and one of its tasks is to study biological threats, including deadly viruses and bacteria.
Since 2005, the American side has been involved in modifying Ukrainian laboratories, selecting and training personnel, and gradually advancing its interests, goals, and tasks in the research field. They are approaching the old Soviet developments. The collection of pathogens and strains in Ukraine, remaining from the Soviet Union, was estimated at $2 billion. The American side did everything to obtain this collection.
After the Maidan, the DTRA expanded its operations in Ukraine with the assistance of Elena Supran, a U.S. citizen and the daughter of Ukrainian immigrants. In Ukraine, she served as the acting Minister of Health. Suprin opened the doors of all biolaboratories in the country to Americans, and even allowed to establish new ones. From that moment, mass experiments on Ukrainians, both civilians and military personnel, have begun. And in the documents of the DTRA, a new abbreviation appeared, UP, which stands for Ukrainian Project.
There were genetic samples collected in large quantities from 4,000 servicemen of the Ukrainian army from different regions of the country, north, south, west, east, including Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Lviv, with 1,000 individuals in each city participating in this blood donation. This was part of the UP8 project. Officially, it was presented with benevolent intentions, namely to determine human body resistance to specific pathogens depending on the region of the country.
According to some reports, in January 2016, in Kharkiv, approximately 20 Ukrainian soldiers died within 2 days from a flu-like virus. Another 200 soldiers were hospitalized.
The intelligence of the Donetsk People's Republic has previously reported on research activities involving American military specialists. Research took place in a closed laboratory located in the village of Shelkostansia. It is situated 30 kilometers from the city of Kharkiv. According to our information, the leakage of the California strain of deadly influenza occurred precisely from there.
From this day onwards, Ukraine turned into a petri dish. Outbreaks of cholera, hepatitis, and botulism were recorded here. But what wouldn't you do for the sake of science, especially in a foreign country? Therefore, in 2020, DTRA spent another $80 million on research in Ukraine.
There wouldn't be an order from the U.S. Secretary of Defense to carry out work on the development of genetically targeted biological weapons on Ukrainian territory. However, it was possible that they would write an order for research to be conducted on combating certain diseases like tularemia more effectively. That's what they would write. And this is what can be found in official documents.
The Pentagon's plans were disrupted by Russia's special operation. Now, the Russians could gain access to documents and biomaterials. This alarmed the United States to such an extent that in March 2022, Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland let the secret out in the Senate.
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of.
Foreign specialists in the areas of plague, cholera, and hepatitis left Ukraine. Instead, the country was filled with soldiers of fortune. However, these guys have been welcome there since the days of the Maidan. This became President Zelensky's 7th commitment. In 2015, the Orbital Operation was launched. It was a British training program for the armed forces of Ukraine, conducted, of course, in accordance with NATO standards. In 2016, Ukraine and the United States signed the concept of development of partnership between the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Department of Defense of the United States for 5 years. In the autumn of 2017, American instructors discussed logistics and cooperation with the Nazi-affiliated Azov Battalion. The following year, Azov Battalion was visited by Canadian military personnel as well.
I think the Ukrainian embassy here in Washington, in violation of the Geneva Conventions on Diplomacy, recruited these people, recruited soldiers, recruited mercenaries for their war against the Russian Federation. The CIA is involved, perhaps not directly, but and military intelligence perhaps not directly, but they're there to advise, to give counsel, to make suggestions, to link people up and help with organization.
A year ago, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated that NATO had trained tens of thousands of Ukrainians.
They have trained Ukrainian troops for years, so tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops are now at the forefront being trained, also for several years being trained by NATO allies, and they're now at the front fighting against invading Russian forces.
In February 2022, hundreds of foreign mercenaries joined them. Among them was the communist and anti-fascist John McIntyre, who served in the U.S. military, like myself. He arrived in Ukraine with the sole purpose of gathering evidence of crimes committed by the armed forces of Ukraine and sharing it with the world. Throughout this time, John risked his life as he could be exposed at any moment. A year later, he managed to escape to Russia.
I can't remember if it's Stavki or Svatki, I can never remember, but I actually seen a church that was blown up. It was so sad to see. I mean, it was the most beautiful church I'd ever seen. They say, oh, that's a Russian church. Yeah, so that's the wrong kind of church because they speak the wrong kind of language, you know.
John said that a mercenary in Ukraine earns around $1,350 per month. However, if a mercenary in Ukraine is involved in combat operations, he gets $3,500 a month. That kind of money, one can kill even unarmed people with impunity.
There was 3 soldiers, Nazar Kuzmin, Rico Chavez, and Aurelio from France. Basically, they took, I believe, 2 or 3 Russian POWs, and they put them in like a trench in the position, and they shot them in the back of the head. And they taken, the reason I've seen this video and photographic evidence is because they take this and they post this to a pro-Russian Telegram channel.
In fact, there's been a long-standing affinity between the United States and Ukrainian nationalists. It began immediately after World War II, when the Americans took the fleeing accomplices of Bandera under their wing. In 1948, the CIA launched a secret operation against the USSR. Later, it was given the code name Aerodynamic.
Frank Wisner Sr., who was a CIA officer in charge. He worked with people who had been given him by the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, Stepan Bandera and Mykola Lebed, who were essentially Nazi collaborators and murderers, war criminals, etc. He put together, with their assistance, recruiting and training Ukrainian dissidents to return to the Ukraine or to be taken out of the Ukraine, trained, and then sent back with weapons. And the intent was to divide the Ukraine from the then Soviet Union and make it into an independent country.
The connection between Ukrainian nationalists and terrorists with the CIA could be exposed. This meant war with the Soviet Union. Therefore, the intelligence agencies slightly modified their subversive activities.
They organized something called Prologue, which was a company in New York City that recruited dissidents and neo-Nazis and old Nazis from the Ukraine to make radio broadcasts, print newspapers, and pamphlets and things. In, I think, 1957, they had something like 1,200 hours of radio broadcasts and 100,000 or so newspapers and magazines that they printed and distributed both in the United States and Canada, and also into the Ukraine.
At the same time, in Canada, a secret operation called Redskin was launched. There is much less information available about it compared to the Aerodynamic. The only known fact is that it also involved Ukrainian nationalists.
They worked with the American intelligence services and with the British to bring a lot of right-wing neo-Nazis or old-time Nazis, people who collaborated with Lebed and Bandera, into Canada and created a tremendous organization called the Ukrainian Conference of Canada.
Today, Canada is the 3rd country in terms of the number of Ukrainians. There are more Ukrainians than in my homeland. For comparison, the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States amounts to around 1 million people, while in Canada, it constitutes 1.3 million people. They represent a significant political force. And, of course, they lobby for the interests of Kyiv and the right-wing radicals in the country. What surprised me is that the descendants of some nationalists are shaping Canada's policies today. For example, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland. Her much-loved grandfather, Mikhailo Komiak, worked as the editor-in-chief of a Nazi newspaper, Krakauer Nachrichten, Krakow News, in Poland. Historical figure of the 20th century. That's how this newspaper referred to Adolf Hitler. Its readers were convinced that the population of Galicia was ready to fight and die for a wholly unjust cause designed by you-know-who. Undoubtedly, children are not responsible for the actions of their parents, but Freeland calls her grandfather not a criminal, but a victim of the Soviet regime, of course. In 2016, Freeland paid tribute to her ancestor on Twitter. It turns out that her grandfather worked diligently to restore freedom and democracy to Ukraine by supporting Hitler and the Holocaust, I suppose. Freeland herself made a contribution to the destruction of the USSR. In the 1980s, she brought anti-Soviet propaganda materials, money, and video and audio recording equipment to Soviet Ukraine for local nationalists. As a result, she was banned from entering the Soviet Union. Today, in Russia, Freeland is also considered persona non grata. However, in the West, her photo with a flag of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, a terrorist organization, does not hinder her political career. It was Freeland, together with former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Boris Johnson, who convinced Western European countries to quickly supply weapons to Ukraine. In 2022, Canada provided Ukraine with $2 billion in direct financial assistance, an additional $500 million through bonds, and over $2.5 billion for military and humanitarian aid. Moreover, in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries, PLAST, which is an analog of Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, operates freely. A youth organization of Ukrainian nationalists that, during World War II, trained militia for the OUN and SS Volunteer Division Galicia. It was established as early as 1911. Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukovich emerged from PLAST. Among active members of this organization were also Canadian Minister Chrystia Freeland. The fostering of xenophobia and Russophobia continues today. PLAST members were present during the Maidan protests and later participated in the killings of residents in Donbass. In 2019, under pressure from the Ukrainian diaspora, Zelensky became the first president to officially recognize the PLAST movement in Ukraine through legislation. It has now become the primary educational structure for young Ukrainians, funded by the state. This is just one aspect of Zelensky's bloody agreement. Let's call it task number 8, the legalization of Nazism. A few years ago, neo-Nazis caused outrage in Western media. However, today, Nazism and fascist insignia have become a fashionable trend. Swastikas, SS symbols, and the Totenkopf skull have become a norm. Even President Zelensky posts photos of them on his social media accounts.
It's just kind of funny, like it's funny to me, like the links that the Ukrainian media and the Western media have to go to, like, hey guys, remove your swastikas for the camera, like we're trying to get a good shot here, you know, your swastikas making us look bad, you know. But some of them are open Nazis, open Nazis. I mean, like there's numerous evidence on the internet of like people with swastika flags and stuff like that, tattoos, and throwing up the Hitler salute, all that stuff. I mean, it's...
In the middle of the last century, Hitler caused deaths of millions of innocent people. His ideology was rooted in hatred towards entire nations. Today, this ideology can be seen within the Ukrainian government and its army.
Basically, you know, you have this culture of like Stepan Bandera and like, oh, Hitler was good and so on and so forth. I've asked him like, okay, you know, you're fighting side by side by all these Polish guys, you know, like you genocide like, you know, 100,000 Polish and Jewish, you know, why are you Nazistic, you know? And they say, oh, well, this was war, this was way back. Like, no, this is genocide, like, you know. So they basically deny this genocide, even still to this day, you know.
We often forget history too quickly in the West. I come from Brittany, and several mass killings during World War II, whether in Oradour-sur-Glane or in Brittany, were committed by Ukrainian forces serving in the Nazi German army. And yet, the West once again seems to believe that having neo-Nazis in Ukraine is acceptable, while we fight them in the West. There is a clear inconsistency, as if there were the good and the bad Nazis.
So it turns out that the good Nazis are the ones who hate and kill Russians and fight against Russia. For these actions, the US and Western Europe seem to forgive all of their sins.
It was necessary to build a Nazi Ukraine. It was being built during Poroshenko's presidency, of course. But bringing it to a state of a military conflict required, so to speak, shaping its population structure and preparing the population for war. And for that, a Jew was the best fit because it provided a colossal excuse. What Nazism, so to speak, could exist with a Jewish president? Where are you from? Where are you from? Tell me, where are you from? He fainted.
As I have discovered, Zelensky himself is not against the Nazis and the atrocities committed by the Azov battalion.
Azov was one of those many battalions. They are what they are. They were defending our country. And later I want to explain to you. Everything from all the components of those volunteer battalions later were incorporated into the military of Ukraine.
Most likely, you haven't heard about it. The TV channel cut out the journalist's question and Zelensky's response. A Jewish president should not respond in such a manner about those who rob and kill unarmed people. We remember the main thing is the picture. Western partners even overlooked the fact that the president of Ukraine and his associates robbed their own army and the supplied weapons. They want to offset the expenses through Ukrainian land. This is Agent Zelensky's ninth task. Fertile lands represented interest even for him. The Ukrainian constitution even has a separate article dedicated to Black Earth or Chernozem.
Even during my time there, in the central office, I heard that the same Monsanto Corporation set its sights on the entire south of Ukraine, from Odessa to Mariupol. During the conflict, it seemed to me that over 30% of major Dutch corporations were present there. Land was actively sold to companies like Cargill and other global corporations that were operating in the region.
For example, Cargill's revenue in 2022 amounted to $165 billion. The GDP of Ukraine as a whole in 2021, before the war, amounted to approximately $200 billion. Until 2021, there was a moratorium on the sale of land in Ukraine. It was extended 10 times during that period, and land was leased out. However, Zelensky urgently needed loans. The IMF offered money in exchange for lifting the moratorium. Ukrainians were afraid that foreigners would start buying up land. In November 2019, the president, perhaps still in the role of the righteous screen character Goloborodko, hurried to reassure the people.
Foreigners and companies with foreign founders will be able to purchase Ukrainian land only if the consent of the Ukrainian people is granted through an all-Ukrainian referendum.
Spoiler, there was no referendum. In July 2021, the moratorium on the sale of land was lifted. Yes, foreigners do not have a formal right to buy land, but there is a loophole. Technically, Ukrainian companies under foreign control can make purchases.
In our country, this is called a straw man. It exists everywhere in the world, where local residents can protect themselves to some extent. In such cases, a fictitious person, a straw man, is employed, and you act as you please.
In February 2018, the Institute of Agricultural Economics assessed Ukrainian land. It turned out to be inexpensive. $2,500 per hectare was the maximum price, but that's the upper limit. The majority are willing to buy land for $1,000. And here's how much agricultural land costs in my home country. So we're in 2018, black soil. Now let's assess arable land in Western Europe. Same year, 2018. So Ukrainian land is inexpensive. It is nearly 13 times cheaper than the most expensive land, which is in Italy. That's why there is high demand for it among Europeans. It makes sense for them to invest in agriculture in Ukraine, since they have limited access to Chernozem. But why should we be concerned about it? Land in America is fine.
This soil is located in Europe, not in the U.S. If it is removed from the food cycle, Europe will have much less chance of being self-sufficient and acting independently. And that's why there is a plan to reduce Europe's food security in order to better control neighboring countries. The U.S. doesn't need the grain, but they need control. And control comes only when you control food security of other countries. And Ukraine was a very, very successful project from the perspective of the U.S.
I would say that Ukraine remains a very successful project for the United States. These are not just agricultural corporations that are making money. In 2022, the investment firm BlackRock offered to help Ukraine rebuild its economy. Of course, this refers to the future prospects.
The BlackRock company has the greatest global influence in society, as it controls almost all banks. It's impossible to even imagine the extent of their assets and the influence they have, both on German and Ukrainian politics.
In May 2023, Zelensky signed an agreement with BlackRock. Last September, the cost of reconstruction and economic recovery of the country was estimated at nearly $350 billion. However, later Kyiv increased the expenses to $1 trillion. After Zelensky's agreement with BlackRock, people started writing on Twitter that Ukraine was becoming privatized and sold to funds. And you know, it seems to be true.
BlackRock doesn't invest in recovery. Instead, it builds dependencies and spheres of influence through reconstruction. Politics, army, and economy form a three-headed dragon currently running the world.
I'm not sure about the entire world, but Ukraine will definitely be working for BlackRock and similar companies for the next 300 years. And at the same time, with the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. From 2014 to 2021, America allocated over $2.5 billion to Ukraine. These are the findings of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, a German research institute. Since the beginning of 2022, the United States have been the leader in terms of military aid provided to Ukraine. From January 2022 to January 2023, Kyiv received over $46 billion for military purposes. Yes, we spent less on the war in Afghanistan, $43 billion over a little more than 9 years. The United Kingdom doesn't spare any expense also. In 2022, they transferred nearly $3 billion to Kyiv, and they plan to spend the same amount in 2023. Over the course of the year, NATO countries have provided Ukraine with approximately $120 billion in assistance.
I may turn out to be a bad prophet, but I am confident that as soon as peace is established in Ukraine, the flow of dollars and credits will stop. And instead, we will be grabbed by the throat on all fronts, demanding the repayment of these debts. Nobody will care that Ukraine is currently incapable of repaying its debts. It simply cannot. Its debts now exceed our gross domestic product significantly.
In May 2022, Biden signed the Lend-Lease law. This means that Ukraine started receiving weapons and equipment on credit, just like the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom during World War II. Agreeing to this plunder became commitment number 10 for Zelensky in this deal with the devil. The president of Ukraine called it a historic step. I would call it a leap into the abyss. Do you know when Russia repaid its debt to the U.S. for Lend-Lease? In 2006. It took them over 60 years to repay the debt. Ukraine already owes the European Union $132 billion, which is 90% of its GDP. Even freezing payments will not allow the economy to settle its debts on time. Meanwhile, the country is experiencing rampant inflation. Food prices have risen by 26.5%. The poverty rate has jumped from 5.5% to 24%, affecting over 7 million people. The country has lost 1/5 of its territory. And, most importantly, hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost.
Iran is a peace candidate. He turned around and betrayed that. And what's always astounded to me is that how he manages to keep so many regular Ukrainian boys going into this war to get themselves killed in a war that they simply cannot win, and yet they keep going. Just in Bakhmut, by the way, the Ukrainians lost more men than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War.
So the rights of millions of citizens have been trampled upon. Ukrainian men are being sent to the front lines to be slaughtered like sacrificial lambs, snatched right off the streets. The Russian language and culture have been practically eradicated. The canonical church is on the verge of being outlawed. The country has been turned into a safari for foreign mercenaries and a testing ground for bloody experiments. Agent Volodymyr Zelensky has accomplished the tasks assigned by foreign intelligence agencies. The question is, will those in power still need someone who knows too much and wants too much?